They mocked the veteran for dragging home a rusted semi until his dog exposed the secret hidden inside. A secret that changed everything. In the quiet mountains of Montana, veteran Caleb Reed brought home a rusted semi. Everyone swore it was nothing but junk. But the first night, Ghost, his loyal German shepherd, sensed something inside. Something no one else could. And when Caleb followed his dog's warning, the truth waiting in that steel would shake the whole town. The wind coming off the Montana mountains carried the dry bite of dust. Caleb Reed stepped through the broken gate of the ironwood salvage yard. The sky above him was a pale winter blue, the kind that made everything look colder than it already was. Beside him moved Ghost, his German shepherd, leaning his weight close, as if ready to steady Caleb if the ground shifted beneath him. Some days it did, at least in his mind. The semi-truck sat at the far end of the yard, like an old animal put out to die. Its once red frame had faded into patches of orange rust. The hood was dented, the mirrors cracked, the tires flat to the rim. Something about it felt forgotten, in a way that punched straight into Caleb's chest. He knew how that felt. "Man, you're not really buying that thing," someone shouted from behind a stack of crushed cars. A couple of workers stepped out, smirking, wiping their hands on dirty rags. Caleb didn't answer. He rarely did anymore. Ghost stood half a step in front of him, ears pointed, body stiff. The dog wasn't aggressive, just protective, in a way only a loyal companion could be. One of the men laughed. "Guess that's what happens when the Corps shakes all the screws loose in your head. You start collecting trash." The words didn't sting the way they used to, but they still registered. A quick, dull throb under the ribs. Caleb kept walking toward the truck, his boots crunching over gravel and broken glass. The smell of old oil and sun-baked rubber filled the air. He placed his hand on the semi's door. Cold metal, rough from the rust. It reminded him of mornings overseas, touching the side of the transport vehicles before dawn. Steady, quiet, waiting. Ghost circled the truck once, nose tracing the bottom edge, as if searching for a scent he couldn't place. Caleb whispered, "Easy, boy." His voice came out low, steady, the way he spoke when grounding himself. Ghost settled but stayed alert. Behind him, more laughter bubbled up. "Hey, Reed, you planning to live in that thing or drive it straight off a cliff? That dog's got more sense than you do." Ghost's head whipped toward them, lips tight, a soft growl rising from deep in his chest. Caleb rested a calming hand on the dog's back. "Not today," he murmured. He didn't tell the workers the truth, that the truck had caught his eye the moment he walked in, that something about it felt wrong and right at the same time. Wrong in the way it had been abandoned, right in the way it refused to collapse completely. Maybe he saw a piece of himself in it. Maybe he was tired of leaving broken things behind. The owner approached with a clipboard, his steps lazy. "You're actually serious about this?" Caleb nodded. "How much for this heap?" The man laughed. "Tell you what, I'll give you a discount so my guys can stop talking about it." He named a price barely higher than scrap metal. Caleb handed over cash without hesitation. When the paperwork was done, he stood alone again with the truck. The laughter faded as the workers drifted back to their routines. The world quieted, except for the hum of the wind and Ghost's steady breathing. Caleb opened the door. It groaned like something waking from a long sleep. Dust drifted in the air, catching the light as he stepped up into the cab. Seats torn, dashboard cracked, a faint smell of mold and old fuel. Ghost jumped up and sat beside him, looking around as if assessing the vehicle himself. "This is us now," Caleb whispered. For a long moment he sat there in the silence, letting the weight of the decisions settle. The mountains loomed behind them, tall, patient, unmoved by the small dramas of the people living under them. Caleb ran a hand through Ghost's fur. "They can laugh," he said softly. "We've survived worse." The dog pressed his head against Caleb's arm in quiet agreement. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, Caleb felt something shift. Not hope, not purpose, not yet, but something like a beginning, something like the faint, distant sound of a story being stirred awake. He stepped out of the truck, Ghost at his heels, and looked back at the rusted giant. It wasn't much, but neither was Caleb once. Ghost gave a single quiet bark, as if sensing something Caleb had not yet realized. This wasn't just a broken machine. It was the first breath of a storm neither of them could see coming. The drive home was slow, the tow straps creaking with every bump in the dirt road. The mountains around Caleb's cabin were deep blue silhouettes against the late evening sky, fading into the kind of quiet only remote Montana could hold. Pines crowded the slopes, their needles rattling softly in the cold wind. Caleb watched them out the window of his pickup as he followed the tow truck carrying the semi, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. Ghost sat upright in the back seat, unmoving except for the occasional twitch of his ears. His deep brown eyes tracked the semi, as if it were a living thing being dragged unwillingly across the land. When they reached the cabin, the driver unhooked the chains, muttered something about crazy vets and their junk, and drove off. His tail lights vanished down the dark road, leaving Caleb and Ghost alone, with the towering shell of rusted steel now sitting at the edge of their property. The night stretched wide and empty around them. The stars were sharp, cold dots scattered across blackness. The kind of sky Caleb used to stare at on desert deployments when sleep wouldn't come. Ghost nudged his hand, grounding him back in the present. "Yeah," Caleb said quietly. "Let's take a look." He walked toward the semi, boots crunching over frozen grass. The truck seemed bigger here than it had at the salvage yard, more imposing, almost out of place in the quiet clearing. Ghost's gait shifted the moment they got close. His steps slowed, his head lowered. A low rumble stirred in his chest. Caleb frowned. "What is it, boy?" Ghost didn't answer. He moved instead, circling the truck with deliberate, tense steps. His nose swept along the rusted metal, as if piecing together a scent trail only he could understand. When he reached the back of the cab, he stopped abruptly. His entire body tightened. A sharp bark cut through the frozen air. Caleb felt the sound vibrate in his chest. Ghost only barked like that when something was wrong. He approached carefully, placing a steadying hand on the dog's flank. Ghost didn't look at him. He stayed locked onto the cab, nostrils flaring, teeth barely visible beneath pulled-back lips. He wasn't afraid. He was alert, warning, protecting. Caleb swallowed. The metallic smell of the truck mixed with the cold air, and something else. Something faint, stale, almost chemical. It hit his senses. It wasn't strong enough to identify, but it wasn't normal. Inside the cab, in the dim beam of Caleb's flashlight, dust swirled like ghostly threads. The torn seat cushions looked even worse in his own yard, like shredded skin peeling from old bones. The air carried a heaviness he couldn't explain. Ghost growled again. Pressing forward with sudden force, Caleb grabbed his collar just in time. "Whoa, easy." Ghost ignored the command, eyes fixed on the rear wall of the cab. He lowered his head and sniffed again, then scratched at the floor, claws clicking against metal. Caleb crouched beside him. The floor panel was dented, scratched, marked with lines that didn't match the rest of the wear. He ran his hand along the seam. The metal felt colder here, almost unnaturally so, as if something beneath it had been shielded from the day's sunlight. A memory flickered. Dark halls, sudden noise, the instinctive lurch toward danger. His breath hitched. He stood quickly, forcing the sensation down where it belonged. "Let's check around the outside." Ghost didn't budge. Caleb pulled gently at the collar. Ghost resisted, then reluctantly backed away a step, though his body stayed angled toward the spot. Walking around the semi, Caleb noticed the way the moonlight hit the welded seams. Most were sloppy, corroded, worn by years of neglect, but near the center of the cab, tucked beneath peeling layers of paint, there was a line. Thin, straight, too precise. Someone had sealed this truck carefully, intentionally. A chill slid along Caleb's spine. Not the cold. Something else. He turned back toward the cab. Ghost hadn't moved. His breathing was faster now, his posture rigid, every muscle engaged. "Okay," Caleb whispered. "What are you trying to tell me?" The dog didn't break his stare. Caleb climbed into the cab again. The stale air felt heavier with every breath. He let the flashlight sweep the interior. The beam landed on a patch behind the driver's seat. Slight discoloration, a panel that looked replaced rather than repaired. He pressed a hand against it. Solid. But beneath it, something felt hollow. The sound around them changed. Caleb didn't notice it at first, but Ghost did. His head snapped toward the tree line. Ears pricked. A distant engine echoed through the woods, slow, crawling, too quiet for a local truck. Caleb killed the flashlight. Darkness swallowed the cab. Ghost pressed against his leg, trembling with alertness, not fear. Caleb peeked through a crack in the windshield. Far down the old logging road, a pair of faint headlights crept along the trees, then stopped. Not near the cabin. Not far enough either. He waited, breath tight in his chest. The headlights remained still for a long, tense moment. Then, slowly, they turned off. No engine, no movement. Just silence stretching across the frozen clearing. Ghost whimpered softly, nudging Caleb's hand. Caleb rested his palm on the dog's back. "Yeah," he whispered, barely audible in the cold air. "I saw it too." They stayed there a long moment, surrounded by darkness and the quiet breath of the mountains. The air seemed to press against Caleb's skin, thick with a warning he didn't yet understand. Something was inside this truck. Something was out there in the woods. And somehow, both were connected. Ghost nudged him again, more insistent this time. Caleb exhaled slowly. "All right," he said, patting the dog's side. "We'll look deeper tomorrow. Tonight we keep watch." Ghost stayed awake beside him long after the cabin lights went dark, eyes fixed on the silent shape of the old semi, as if guarding a secret only he could hear. Morning came in pale streaks of gold slipping through the thin curtains of the cabin. The mountain air carried the crisp bite of pine and cold earth. Caleb hadn't slept more than a couple hours, waking every time the wind shifted or a branch cracked outside. Ghost hadn't slept at all. Caleb could tell by how the dog moved, alert but tired, as if he were afraid to look away from the truck even for a moment. Caleb brewed coffee and stepped out onto the frosted porch, mug warming his hands. The semi sat where they had left it, hulking and lifeless, yet somehow imposing in the early light. The sun softened some of the rust's harshness, but not its history. Caleb felt a tug behind his ribs, some blend of curiosity, unease, and something almost like recognition. Ghost trotted ahead. Tail low but steady, nose lifted to taste the morning air. The dog moved with purpose, heading straight for the truck. Caleb followed, setting his mug on a stump as he crouched beside the cab. "All right, boy," he murmured. "Show me." Ghost went to the same spot as last night, the floor behind the driver's seat. Caleb climbed inside, the metal groaning under his weight. Dust swirled lazily where the beam of morning sun slipped through a crack in the roof. The smell of stale foam, old wiring, and cold steel filled the confined space. Ghost pressed his nose to the seam on the floor, pawing once, then twice. Caleb ran his hand over the seam, fingers brushing aside years of grit. The line was almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. But now that he did, he couldn't unsee it. The metal was smoother there, colder, too clean for something supposedly abandoned for a decade. He tapped the area lightly. A dull, hollow sound answered him. He tapped again. Harder. The echo was unmistakable. "There's space under here," he whispered. Ghost gave a sharp, low bark, as if confirming what Caleb already felt. Caleb leaned back and let his eyes wander across the cab, really looking this time. He examined the welds along the interior walls. Most were rough, flaking, scarred by rust, but a few, the ones forming a rectangle around the mysterious floor panel, were too perfect, straight, precise. The kind of work done by someone who cared deeply about what they were hiding. Someone with training. Someone who didn't want this truck's secret found. Caleb's pulse tightened. His mind flicked through memories like someone pulling file folders in the dark. Mechanics in the core. Engineers he'd worked with. The way reinforced plating looked on transport units. Clean welds, straight seams, deliberate joins. He swallowed hard and forced himself to breathe. This truck wasn't just patched up. It had been modified, reinforced, purposefully sealed. "Who did this to you?" he murmured to the empty cab. Ghost bumped his shoulder with his nose. Caleb's gaze drifted to the back wall of the cab. Something about it felt wrong. The metal didn't match the rest of the interior. The color of the paint beneath the dirt was slightly darker, like a later addition. He brushed his hand across it and felt a faint ripple where two metals met, not factory-made. He stepped out of the truck to get a different angle. The sun reflected off the rear panel at a strange line, a faint shimmer he hadn't noticed before. He leaned in, squinting. Another weld, almost invisible. Almost. Someone had sealed the back wall shut. Caleb stepped back, heart thudding. He wasn't imagining this. These welds weren't random repairs. They were intentional, hidden, done with skill. He let his hand rest against the metal, feeling its cold bite against his skin. He didn't recognize the truck, but something about the craftsmanship felt familiar. Military familiar. Secure familiar. The kind of construction used to hold something or someone safely inside. Caleb's throat tightened. The sound of gravel crunching pulled his attention back to the clearing. A truck door slammed somewhere down the road. Caleb stiffened instinctively, Ghost raising his head, ears snapping to attention. Voices floated faintly through the trees, too far to make out words, but close enough that Caleb's pulse began to climb. Not again. He stood tall, forcing himself to focus. The voices faded, carried away by the wind, leaving only stillness behind. "You're jumpy," he whispered to Ghost. But he knew the truth. PTSD wasn't just nightmares and memories. It was the awareness, the instinct, the constant tension in his shoulders. the expectation that something was always coming. He knelt beside Ghost, rubbing the fur between the dog's ears until the tension in both their bodies eased a little. Inside the cab again, Caleb pulled a small screwdriver from his toolbox. He scraped lightly along the top of the back wall. Paint dust crumbled away, revealing a faint indentation beneath. Letters, tiny, etched, barely there. Caleb stared at them, breath freezing in his chest. They weren't full words, just the kind of coded markings he had seen before on modified transport rigs overseas, the kind used by units who didn't want full labeling, the kind used by crews who built hidden compartments for supply runs that needed to be off the books. "Why would a truck like this be in Montana?" he whispered. Ghost nudged him again, more insistent this time. Caleb stepped out of the cab with the screwdriver still in hand. The morning felt heavier suddenly, the air thick with warning. The truck was no longer just a curiosity. The welds were too clean, the marks too deliberate, the hollow beneath the floor too precise. Someone had built something secret here, something important, something dangerous enough that the night before a vehicle had stopped on the road and killed its headlights. Caleb looked at the truck with fresh eyes, no longer seeing rust, dents, or broken glass. For the first time, he saw intention. He let out a long, uneasy breath. "This isn't just an old semi," he said softly. Ghost, standing at his side, growled low in agreement. The truck wasn't abandoned. It had been hidden. And now, for reasons Caleb couldn't yet name, it felt like the eyes of the mountains themselves were watching, waiting for him to discover why. The day darkened early, clouds rolling in from the west and swallowing the last of the sun. A cold wind swept across Caleb's property, bending the tall grass and rattling loose siding on the old shed. The semi loomed like a shadow of its own, a rusted silhouette against the tree line. Caleb tried to focus on cleaning the outer welds, but the air felt heavier than usual, thicker, like warning smoke before a wildfire. Ghost sensed it too. The dog paced the edge of the clearing, tail pointed low, ears high and sharp. Every few minutes he stopped, staring deep into the woods as if expecting someone to step out. "Ghost," Caleb called softly. "Come on back, boy." Ghost didn't move. He let out a soft growl instead. Something so low Caleb felt it through the ground more than heard it. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag and followed the dog's gaze. At first he saw nothing but dark pines and fading light, then movement, barely there. A quick shift, like a figure stepping behind a tree trunk when spotted. Caleb stiffened, his breath caught in his throat. The night before, the headlights. This morning, voices on the road. Now shadows in the trees. He felt the old instincts rise, uninvited, heightened senses. Heart pounding slow and deep. Lungs filling with cold air the way they used to before breaching a darkened doorway overseas. He forced a long exhale. "This is Montana, not Afghanistan," he muttered. But the reassurance felt thin even to him. Ghost let out a sharp bark that sliced through the cold air. Caleb grabbed his collar on instinct, steadying himself against the dog's tense pull. "Easy," he whispered. "Let's not start anything tonight." But the feeling wouldn't leave him. Something or someone was out there. He backed toward the cabin. Ghost pressed tight against his leg like a second heartbeat. Inside, Caleb locked the door and dropped the deadbolt. He didn't always need to do that out here. But today it felt necessary, protective, maybe even smart. Ghost sat by the window, refusing to look away from the tree line. The woods outside grew darker. The clearing quieted in that strange, complete way that made even the wind stop. Caleb tried to settle his breathing, tried to remind himself that critters and stray hunters roamed these parts all the time. But then a deep rumble rolled across the mountains, the unmistakable sound of a vehicle engine. Slow crawling. Careful. Not the kind of engine sound locals made. The locals drove loud old trucks with mufflers that rattled the whole canyon. But this sounded controlled, too smooth, too deliberate. Caleb moved closer to the window, standing behind Ghost. The dog pressed his nose against the cold glass. Down the old logging road, two faint beams of headlights flickered between branches. They weren't headed toward him, just idling, like the vehicle was parked facing his cabin. Caleb's heartbeat began to throb in his ears. "Not again," he whispered. The lights stayed still, watching, waiting. Caleb reached into the top drawer of the side table without thinking. His hand hovered over an old flashlight, its metal body scuffed from years of use, but he stopped himself. He used to keep a sidearm there, too, but after coming home, he'd put it away for good. He wasn't ready to hold that kind of weight anymore, not with the memories attached to it. Ghost's growl vibrated the wooden floorboards beneath them. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the headlights clicked off. The engine shut down. Silence drowned the woods. Caleb's throat tightened. He backed away from the window, feeling an old, familiar panic push at the edges of his chest. He crouched, pressing a hand against the floor and closing his eyes. "You're okay," he whispered to himself. "Breathe in. Breathe out. You're home. You're not under fire." But the past didn't always listen to reason. Ghost nudged him gently, pushing his head beneath Caleb's arm and pulling him upright with quiet insistence. Caleb let out a slow breath and steadied himself on the dog's back. "Thanks," he said softly. The lights didn't return. Minutes passed, then an hour. Darkness folded fully over the mountains, and the only sound left was the sighing wind pushing against the pines. But something in Caleb's gut twisted. Someone was watching. Someone who knew to turn off their vehicle at just the right time. Someone interested in the semi. The next morning, frost covered the ground like thin glass. Ghost was already outside when Caleb stepped onto the porch, standing rigid near the semi. The dog's posture had changed overnight. Less curious, more protective. Caleb joined him and noticed something in the soil near the truck's rear tire. He knelt, brushing aside the frost. Tracks, fresh ones, human. The tread was clean, heavy, and unfamiliar. Someone had walked up to the truck while they slept. Ghost whined softly and pressed closer to Caleb's side. Caleb stood slowly, scanning the tree line, his breath clouded in the cold air. The mountains stood silent above him, but he no longer felt alone in their shadow. Whoever had been watching last night had stepped onto his land, had touched the truck, had stood close enough to hear Ghost breathing. Caleb swallowed the hard knot of dread rising in his throat. "Something's wrong with this truck, Ghost," he murmured. "And someone out there knows it." The wind rustled through the pines again, but it no longer sounded like nature. It sounded like a warning, and the day had barely begun. By mid-morning, the clouds had thickened, casting a dim gray light over the clearing. Caleb tried to work through the unease still lingering from the night before, but every clang of his wrench seemed too loud, too exposed. Ghost stayed glued to his side. The dog's attention split between Caleb's movements and the dark wall of trees surrounding the property. The semi loomed beside them, its silent frame carrying a tension Caleb felt in his bones. He reached under the cab to loosen a rusted bolt. But Ghost suddenly stiffened. His ears snapped upward, his body locked into a rigid stance. "What is it?" Caleb whispered. Ghost took a few cautious steps backward, nose lifted, sniffing hard. His muscles quivered with warning. Caleb set the wrench down slowly, standing straight, scanning the woods and the ground as he had done 1,000 times in foreign places. A faint metallic scent drifted toward him, strange and out of place in the cold air. He followed it with his eyes, moving toward the back of the truck. Ghost darted ahead, nose low, weaving through patches of frost. "Ghost, hold up!" Caleb called, but it was too late. A sharp, startled yelp cut through the clearing. Caleb's heart seized. He sprinted toward the sound, boots skidding on the frozen ground. Ghost lay near the rear tire, one front leg drawn close to his body, breathing fast. A small metal trap, crudely set, spring-loaded, was clamped around his paw. It wasn't large enough to break bone, but it was enough to hurt him and pin him in place. "Oh no, Ghost," Caleb breathed, kneeling beside him. The dog whimpered softly, his eyes wide with pain and confusion. Caleb steadied his shaking hands and worked the trap's release mechanism. The steel resisted for a moment, cold and stiff, before snapping open with a jolt. Caleb tossed it aside, pulling Ghost gently into his arms. "You're okay," he murmured, voice cracking. "You're okay, buddy. I've got you." Ghost buried his muzzle against Caleb's chest, trembling. Caleb inspected the paw. No deep cuts, just swelling and tenderness. Relief washed through him like a wave, but it didn't cool the burning anger rising beneath it. Someone had set that trap on his land, right next to the semi. The realization struck like a hammer. Ghost nudged his shoulder, urging him to breathe. Caleb closed his eyes, pressing a hand against the dog's warm fur, grounding himself. But the fury stayed slow, simmering, patient. He carried Ghost inside, cleaned the paw, and wrapped it with care. The dog endured it quietly, leaning into Caleb as if trying to reassure him. "Why would someone do this?" Caleb whispered to the empty air. Ghost's eyes tracked him, soft and unwavering, loyal even through pain. Caleb stepped outside again, leaving the door cracked so Ghost could see him. The cold felt sharper now, slicing against his cheeks. He walked toward the trap, crouching beside it. The metal wasn't old. It wasn't rusted like something forgotten in the woods. It was new, fresh, placed within the last 12 hours. Caleb scanned the ground again, forcing himself to think methodically. The frost had melted around the trap, revealing a scuff mark, a boot print, partial but clear enough to tell him someone had been here after dawn. "First the headlights," he muttered, jaw tightening. "Then the tracks. Now this." He straightened, muscles taut with tension. His breaths came slow, measured. But the faint tremor in his fingers betrayed the storm building inside him. PTSD didn't always arrive as flashbacks. It often came as pressure, as the sense that danger was already closing in. Ghost barked softly from the doorway, limping forward on 3 legs to stand beside him. "You should be resting," Caleb said, kneeling again. Ghost pressed his head against Caleb's shoulder as if insisting, "I'm not leaving you alone out here." The thought tightened Caleb's throat. He rose again and walked back to the semi, Ghost limping close behind. The truck looked different now. Not just suspicious, not just modified. It looked claimed. Someone else had marked it. Someone who didn't want Caleb near it. He rested his hand on the cold metal surface. His reflection stared back faintly. Tired eyes, unshaven jaw, shadows beneath both. "Who are you?" he whispered to the truck. "What do you have inside that's worth hurting my dog?" Ghost let out a soft whine and leaned against his leg. Caleb crouched, wrapping an arm around the dog's shoulders. "You saved me more times than I can count," he said quietly. "I won't let anyone come after you. Not ever." The wind picked up again, rattling the branches overhead. Something about the sound felt different now, less like nature, more like a call pushing him forward. The semi wasn't just a mystery anymore, it was a threat, and the threat had arrived on his land. Caleb stood, resolve hardening. "We're finding out what's inside this thing," he said. "Today." Ghost, even hurt, wagged his tail once. Together they turned toward the tools scattered across the clearing, the mountains looming behind them like silent witnesses. Whoever had set that trap had made a mistake. They had picked the wrong veteran. And the wrong dog. The cold Montana afternoon settled thick and gray over the clearing as Caleb gathered his tools. The semi stood silent, its rusted skin catching faint glimmers of light through the clouds. Ghost limped beside him, favoring his injured paw, but refusing to stay indoors. The dog moved slowly, but with a stubborn fire in his eyes that reminded Caleb of Marines he'd served with. Wounded, hurting, but unbreakable. "All right, buddy," Caleb said softly. "Show me again." Ghost nudged the cab door with his nose, then backed up a step, giving Caleb room to climb inside. Despite everything, the trap, the fear, the night of headlights disappearing into the woods, Ghost was determined, almost driven. Whatever was inside this truck, the dog felt it with an instinct Caleb had learned years ago to trust without question. Caleb hauled himself into the driver's seat and let his eyes adjust to the dim interior. Dust still swirled in the cold air, and the scent of rust was thick, metallic, grounding. He moved to the spot where Ghost had been signaling for days, the floor behind the driver's seat. The seams looked even more deliberate in the afternoon light. Caleb placed both palms on the panel, steadying his breath. "Let's find out what you've been hiding." He reached for the angle grinder and switched it on. The motor hummed low at first, then roared, vibrating through his hands. Sparks erupted as the blade kissed the steel. Orange light danced off the windows as metal resisted the intrusion. It wasn't like cutting into old, weak welds. This was solid, reinforced. Someone had built this to last. Ghost barked from outside. A sharp warning. Caleb paused and checked the tree line. Nothing moved. The forest stood still, but the stillness itself felt watchful. He kept working. Minutes crawled by. Sparks scattered across the cab floor. The panel grew hot, the smell of metal thickening the air. Caleb's muscles trembled, not from fear this time, but effort. Steady, relentless. Sweat formed along his brow despite the cold. Then, a sound changed, a soft shift, a groan of metal loosening. Caleb shut off the grinder. Silence fell so sharply it rang in his ears. He set the tool aside and touched the panel. It trembled under his fingers, no longer solidly fused. He pried at the edges with a crowbar. The metal resisted, then let go all at once with a low, hollow pop. The panel swung inward like a door. Behind it, darkness waited. Ghost whined low and urgent. Caleb lifted his flashlight, its beam slicing into the hidden space. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a small compartment. It wasn't a stash. It was an entire room carved into the truck's frame. A miniature chamber lined with steel plating, reinforced and carefully welded. Every seam was perfect, every surface smooth and intentional. This wasn't patchwork work done at a roadside garage. This was deliberate engineering. Military engineering. Caleb crawled inside, his shoulders brushing the reinforced walls. The chamber was roughly the size of a walk-in closet, but built with precision. He ran his hand along the cool metal, feeling the faint vibration of distant memories. Transport units, secured cargo bays, protected routes. This wasn't built for freight, he whispered. Ghost squeezed himself halfway inside, pawing at a metal box bolted to the chamber floor. Caleb angled the flashlight toward it. A gray steel container sat secured in place, its corners rounded, its edges seamless. A faint engraving marked the top, barely visible under layers of grime. Caleb brushed it with the sleeve of his jacket. A symbol appeared, a unit emblem, a unit that no longer existed on paper. A chill ran down his spine. "Ghost," he whispered. "What did we just find?" He reached for the box. It didn't budge. He tried again, using more force. This time it shifted, groaning softly. The bolts held it, but only barely. Someone had wanted it accessible, but only to the right hands. Caleb inhaled deeply and gripped the metal latches. They were stiff at first, but as he applied pressure, one snapped open with a loud metallic click. Ghost barked again. A short, sharp sound that echoed in the chamber. Caleb paused. His heartbeat hammered in his chest. "Okay," he said quietly. "Here goes." He lifted the lid. Inside lay carefully arranged bundles wrapped in oilcloth. A map case. Several folders tied with string. A thick envelope sealed with wax. The smell of old paper hit him, damp and preserved in the cold metal chamber. Caleb reached in and pulled out the first folder. The paper felt fragile between his fingers, but the writing inside was sharp, deliberate. He skimmed the first page. Coordinates, handwritten notes, routed paths through remote regions, references to transfers and safe passages. His pulse quickened. Another sheet caught his eye. Older than the rest, its edges more worn. His breath hitched when he recognized the handwriting. It was a hand he had seen before, 12 years ago, in birthday cards, in short notes left on the kitchen table, in the letter that never made sense after the day his brother disappeared. Lucas Reed. Caleb swallowed hard, throat tightening as he traced the familiar loops in the pen strokes. Ghost nudged him gently, sensing the shift in his breathing, sensing the pain. Caleb blinked hard, fighting the sting in his eyes. "Why would Lucas's handwriting be in here?" he whispered. Something else lay in the corner of the box, wrapped in cloth. Caleb reached for it slowly, hands trembling. The cloth fell away to reveal metal. Cold, worn, familiar. A dog tag. His brother's dog tag. Caleb froze. Ghost pressed into him, whining softly. Caleb closed his eyes, holding the tag against his forehead. A wave of grief crashing through him, raw and sudden, like losing Lucas all over again. The cabin, the semi, the mountains. They all blurred into silence as Caleb tried to steady his breathing. After a long moment, he set the dog tag down gently, almost reverently, and looked back at the hidden chamber. Maps, notes, plans, a sealed envelope with his brother's initials. Lucas hadn't just died on a mission. Lucas had built this. He had built this truck. He had built this chamber. He had built it for a reason, and someone had wanted it buried. Outside, wind swept through the pines with a low, mournful howl. The sky darkened, as if the mountains themselves understood the weight of what had been uncovered. Caleb exhaled tremulously and looked at Ghost. This changes everything. The dog rested his head on Caleb's lap, eyes soft with a loyalty deeper than words. The hidden chamber had been opened. Lucas's ghost had stirred, and whatever truth waited inside those files had only just begun to rise into the light. The daylight faded faster than usual, leaving the Montana clearing washed in blue-gray dusk. Caleb sat on the edge of the semi's cab floor, the cold metal of Lucas's dog tag resting against his palm. Ghost lay pressed against his leg, head heavy on Caleb's thigh, as if the dog sensed that Caleb needed anchoring more now than ever. The folder with Lucas's handwriting lay open beside them. The neat, purposeful strokes carved straight into Caleb's heart in a way no battlefield ever had. Lucas had written these notes. Lucas had built this chamber. Lucas had used this truck for something no one had ever told Caleb about. And Lucas had disappeared 12 years ago without a trace. Caleb inhaled slowly, letting the cold mountain air steady him. The pain was sharp at first, raw, like an old wound being forced open. But beneath it ran something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, fragile, flickering, but real. He pulled out another page. The writing was hurried, uneven, almost frantic. Movement unavoidable. People scared. Must adapt route. Truck holds them safely. Steel reinforced. If anything happens to me, continue the line. Caleb's hands shook. The memories came unbidden. Lucas smiling as he held a fishing pole too tight. Lucas stealing Caleb's bike when they were kids. Lucas hugging him goodbye at the bus station when Caleb left for his first deployment. Lucas standing on the porch in the rain the last night Caleb saw him. Saying only, "Take care of Mom, I'll be back soon." Lucas never came back. Caleb swallowed hard, wiping a trembling thumb across the edge of the paper. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. Ghost nudged him gently, sensing the shift, his eyes soft with empathy. Caleb placed a hand on his fur, grounding himself again. He reached deeper into the box and pulled out a bound packet of small photos. They were faded, the edges curled, but the images inside carried unmistakable weight. People. Families standing beside the semi. Children wrapped in blankets. Women with faces tired but relieved. Men with dust on their clothes and fear still clinging to their eyes. Ghost sniffed at one photograph, then looked up at Caleb as if asking a question he couldn't yet answer. "These people," Caleb murmured. Lucas was helping them. He flipped through more notes. Border crossings unsafe, violence rising, using the truck to shelter them, keep them hidden. They trust me. They have no one else. Caleb's heartbeat thudded painfully against his ribs. This wasn't mercenary work. This wasn't trafficking. This wasn't crime. This was a rescue operation. Quiet, hidden, unrecognized. A dangerous one. Lucas had risked everything to protect others, and he died for it. A knot of grief twisted deep inside Caleb. He clenched the dog tag tight enough for the metal to carve into his palm. Ghost whined softly, pressing his nose into Caleb's shoulder, reminding him he wasn't alone. "I should have known," Caleb said. "I should have asked more questions." But even as the guilt rose, another piece clicked into place. The reason Caleb had felt something familiar when he first touched the truck. The reason the welds looked military grade. The reason strangers were watching the clearing from the road. The reason someone had set a trap for Ghost. Someone didn't want this story coming to light. And someone had been waiting for the truck to stay buried in that salvage yard. Caleb stood, pacing the narrow line between the semi and the pine trees. The cold wind stung his cheeks, grounding him. The mountains loomed above, silent sentinels to the pain unraveling inside him. He turned back to Ghost. "They didn't just hide your chamber, boy. They wanted it gone, and they wanted Lucas's work forgotten." Ghost limped toward him, standing tall despite the injury, his gaze sharp and steady. Caleb crouched down and took the dog's face gently in both hands. "He wasn't just my big brother," he said quietly. "He was a good man. The kind of man who'd do anything to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." Ghost's tail gave one small wag, slow and heavy with meaning. Caleb looked back at the semi, feeling the weight of everything shift inside him. "We're not walking away from this. Not now." He climbed into the hidden chamber again, searching for more answers. Near the bottom of the steel box, beneath the folders, something hard pressed against his fingertips. He pulled it out carefully. A small notebook, weather-beaten, but intact. Lucas's name etched faintly on the inside cover. Caleb opened to the first page. "Caleb, if you ever find this, I didn't disappear by accident." The words slammed into him like a punch. His breath caught, his vision blurred. He blinked hard and continued reading. There were people who wanted this stopped. People with money, influence, connections. "I kept the truck hidden as long as I could. If they come after you..." The sentence cut off abruptly. The page ended in a jagged tear. Ghost barked, startled by the way Caleb's body tensed. Caleb closed the notebook gently. His fingers were cold, but his resolve burned hot beneath the surface. Lucas hadn't abandoned them. He hadn't failed. He had been silenced. And now Caleb knew too much to back away. He stepped out of the truck, notebook held tightly at his side, Ghost following close. The air felt different, like the first moment before a storm breaks open over the mountains. He looked at the dog. "We're going to finish what he started, Ghost." The dog gave a soft, determined bark. The semi-door creaked shut behind them, echoing through the clearing like a promise. A promise that the truth was no longer buried. A promise that someone would come looking for it. And a promise that Caleb Reed, broken, grieving, determined, would not let his brother's legacy die in the dark. Ghost limped beside him, eyes bright with loyalty. Together they stepped into the gathering twilight, ready for whatever would come next. The night settled cold and silent over the mountains, the kind of silence that made even the trees seem to hold their breath. Caleb locked up the semi, slid the steel latch into place, and guided Ghost toward the cabin. The dog's steps were slower, careful on his injured paw, but his gaze kept drifting back toward the truck, as if he expected something else to crawl out of its secret chamber. Inside the cabin, Caleb set the notebook on the kitchen table, poured warm water into a bowl for Ghost, and wrapped another layer of gauze around the dog's swollen paw. Ghost winced a little, but stayed still, leaning lightly into Caleb's hand. The small show of trust hit Caleb harder than he expected. "You're tougher than I'll ever be," Caleb murmured. Ghost nudged him gently, as if disagreeing. For a few precious minutes, the quiet felt safe. The humming of the old refrigerator, the ticking of the clock above the sink, the gentle crackle of the heater, it all wrapped around them like a worn blanket. Caleb allowed himself to breathe, but deep down, the storm was still rolling in. He felt it. Ghost felt it. Even the mountains seemed to bristle with anticipation. A sudden knock shattered the quiet, sharp, uninvited. 3 firm taps on the door. Ghost lunged upright, growling deep in his chest. Caleb stiffened, hand sliding instinctively toward the flashlight on the counter. A tool, not a weapon, but heavy enough if he needed it. No one should be out here. Not at this hour, not on a weekday, not this deep into the woods. Another knock. Slower this time, as if the visitor knew Caleb was hesitating. Caleb forced steady breaths and approached the door, pulling Ghost gently behind him. He peered through the small window. A man stood on the porch, late 50s, tall but slightly stooped, wearing an old ranger-style coat and a baseball cap pulled low over graying hair. His posture was relaxed, but something about him set Caleb on edge. He wasn't a neighbor, and he wasn't lost. Caleb cracked the door just enough to speak. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Evening. I'm Paul Vance. I think you knew my old colleague, Lucas Reed." Every muscle in Caleb's body froze. Ghost growled harder, pushing his muzzle through the crack in the doorway. Vance's eyes flicked to the dog. "He's protective. Good. Lucas always said dogs were better judges of character than people." Caleb's grip tightened on the doorframe. "What do you want?" Vance lifted his hand slightly, palms open. "I promise I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to ask you a few things about the truck." Caleb's pulse hammered in his ears. "What truck?" Vance smiled again, this time with something colder beneath it. "The one you dragged out of Ironwood salvage? The one your brother used?" Caleb didn't respond. Ghost's growl deepened. "I worked with Lucas for years," Vance continued. "He trusted me. He'd want me to look out for you, especially now that certain eyes are turning back to that vehicle." Caleb opened the door another inch, just enough to see Vance's face more clearly. His eyes were sharp, scanning, calculating. He didn't look afraid of Ghost. He didn't look afraid of anything. "What do you mean, certain eyes?" Caleb asked cautiously. Vance hesitated, then sighed. "Look, Caleb. Lucas was involved in something complicated, something the government didn't want connected to them. Good work, but dangerous. When he disappeared, a lot of people breathed easier. And now that you've uncovered his truck—" "I didn't uncover anything," Caleb cut in. "It was just scrap." Vance's smile faded. "Don't insult my intelligence. You found the compartment, didn't you?" Every instinct screamed not to answer. Ghost barked sharply, snapping the air between them. Vance flinched slightly. Not from fear, but from irritation. "Control your dog." Caleb's voice dropped low. "He knows when someone doesn't belong here." "Caleb," Vance said, voice lowering to a gravelly calm, "what was in that truck was never meant for you. If you hand it over, this ends quietly. No one needs to bother you or your dog again." The threat hung in the cold night air, wrapped in politeness, disguised as concern, but unmistakable. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You need to leave." Vance's expression shifted. Soft pity layered over something far more dangerous. "Lucas wanted to protect people, but he was reckless. Don't make the same mistake." Caleb shut the door. Firm. Final. Ghost barked loudly, lunging at the wood as if he wanted to tear through it. Caleb held him back with effort. Outside, Vance didn't knock again. He didn't shout. He simply stood there for several seconds, long enough to send a cold ripple down Caleb's spine, before his footsteps retreated from the porch. Caleb waited until the sound faded entirely, then checked through the window. A black SUV idled near the trees, the same one from the road. Vance got in, the door closing with a soft thud. The vehicle reversed down the gravel path, disappearing into the darkness as if it had never been there. Ghost pressed against Caleb's side, trembling with anger, not fear. Caleb knelt and wrapped an arm around him. "I know, boy. I know." His stomach churned with a hollow, familiar dread, the kind that told him he had stepped into something far bigger than he realized. The semi wasn't just a mystery. Vance wasn't just an old colleague, and Lucas's disappearance hadn't been an accident. Caleb turned and looked at the notebook on the table. Lucas's unfinished sentence echoed in his mind like a warning carried on the cold wind. "If they come after you," Caleb closed his eyes. "They already have." The words hung in the air like frost. Settling into the quiet cabin. For a long moment, he didn't move. Ghost pressed his weight gently against Caleb's leg, sensing the storm inside him the way only a loyal dog could. The night outside was still, but it felt like the woods were listening, waiting for his next move. He opened his eyes and exhaled slowly, grounding himself the way the VA therapist had taught him years ago. Count what's real. Count what's here. 1, the table. 2, the chair. 3, Ghost's steady breath. It helped just enough for him to reach toward the notebook again. He flipped it open to the coded sketches, the clipped notations, the fragments left behind by Lucas. Every page felt fragile, as if touching it wrong might erase the last trace of his brother from the world. Caleb whispered into the dim cabin, "What were you doing, Lucas? What were you carrying in that truck?" Ghost gave a soft whine and nudged the notebook with his nose. "Yeah," Caleb murmured. "We dig." He rose from the table, pain flickering through old injuries as he crossed the room. He grabbed a small portable heater, a lantern, and his jacket. The temperature was dropping fast. It would be a cold night, but there wouldn't be any sleep. Not now. The semi waited in the dark like a steel sentinel. Caleb pushed open the garage door. The lantern's glow spilled across the metal giant, revealing dust, scars, and the faint gleam of concealed craftsmanship buried beneath years of neglect. Ghost limped ahead, circling the truck with a purposeful sniff, as though reacquainting himself with an old enemy. Caleb climbed into the cabin, lantern in hand. The smell hit him again. Old grease, rust, and something deeper. A faint trace of diesel soaked into metal over a lifetime of miles. But now, mixed in with the familiar scents, there was something new. A sense of history rising like dust after a long sleep. He knelt at the revealed compartment, fingers brushing the cool steel. Inside waited the box he hadn't dared open fully the night before. He drew it out slowly. It was heavier than it looked. Solid metal, edges worn, the latch stiff from age. Ghost stood close, ears perked, watching intently. Caleb flipped the latch. The box opened with a low metallic groan. Inside lay folders wrapped in waxed paper, bound with string, as if someone expected them to be carried through rough terrain. Beneath them, something glinted. A key ring, old and tarnished, holding 3 brass keys of different shapes. But it was the folders that drew him first. He untied the string and peeled back the waxed paper. The first folder held photographs, dozens of them, some bent, some water-stained. Ghost leaned in beside him as Caleb sifted through them. Faces, children, families. People bruised but hopeful. People wearing the look of someone escaping something unspeakable. Each photo was marked with a location scrawled in Lucas's handwriting. New Mexico safe, Wyoming route, avoid patrol, Oregon drop successful. Caleb's throat tightened. Lucas hadn't been smuggling contraband, he had been rescuing people. Ghost whimpered softly, sensing Caleb's shifting breath. Another folder held maps, hand-drawn routes across the American West, weaving through mountain passes, empty highways, forgotten service roads. The lines were dense with markings Caleb didn't recognize. Triangles, circles, and tiny symbols like coded instructions. Then he found the pages that changed everything. Reports, notes, briefings written in Lucas's unmistakable blocky handwriting, and one document. Short, blunt, bearing the faded logo of a federal unit Caleb didn't recognize. His eyes scanned it. Operation Night Passage, non-official channel. No digital record authorized. Handler, L. Reed. Route designation, Ghost Line. Caleb blinked. Ghost Line, he repeated under his breath. He flipped to the next page and froze. There were names. People Lucas had escorted. Not criminals, not fugitives. Families running from violent groups along the border. Individuals marked as high-risk humanitarian evac. Every line hinted at something darker just beyond the words. The next notes mentioned threats, gangs, traffickers, corrupt officials who benefited from fear and silence. Lucas had been slipping people through the cracks, one rescued life at a time. Caleb whispered, "You were doing good work, and they buried you for it." Ghost pressed his head into Caleb's side. The anger rose slowly, quiet but sharp. For years he'd believed Lucas had vanished because of a failed mission, or because he'd been reckless, or because he'd abandoned the family. But now, piece by piece, the truth spilled out of the shadows. Lucas had vanished because doing the right thing had put him in someone's crosshairs. Caleb kept reading. The last section of the file sent a chill crawling down his spine. Unknown entity tracking route. Possible leak. Paul Vance informed. Proceed with caution. Caleb's breath stilled. Vance's name wasn't beside any warnings. It was beside a single phrase underlined. Status: compromised. He stared at the word until his pulse pounded in his ears. Ghost growled low, sensing Caleb's shift in energy. "That man wasn't here to help," Caleb whispered. "He wasn't here for me." He looked back at the steel wall, the hidden compartment, the truck Lucas had turned into a mobile sanctuary. He looked at the last page again. A final handwritten note from Lucas. A sentence cut short. "If they come after you." The page ended abruptly, torn or unfinished. For a moment, Caleb couldn't move. The weight of grief pressed on him, mixing with anger, fear, and something else. Purpose. He touched the letters again. "You didn't die in vain, Lucas." Ghost gave a soft bark of agreement. Caleb stacked the documents carefully, placing them back inside the metal box. His hands shook, not from fear, but from certainty. Whatever Lucas had been part of wasn't over. Whatever danger had killed him was stirring again. And Caleb wasn't the kind of man to look away. He wasn't alone, either. Ghost nudged the keys. One of them, a long, narrow brass key, slid slightly, catching the lantern light. Caleb picked it up. "What do you open?" he murmured. Ghost barked once, low but clear. A promise, a warning, a vow. Caleb tightened his grip on the key. The path had been Lucas's once. Now it was his. Tomorrow he would take this further. He would not let his brother's truth die in the dark. Tonight, he would prepare. And somewhere out in the cold mountain night, an engine hummed faintly. Far enough to seem harmless, close enough to send a shiver down Caleb's spine. Ghost's ears twitched. Caleb whispered, "They're watching." Ghost stepped closer, eyes locked on the woods beyond the window, and the semi, silent and waiting, seemed to breathe with them, as if awakening to its purpose again. The truth wasn't buried anymore, and neither was Caleb. He felt different when he woke the next morning. like someone had lifted a weight he'd been carrying so long he no longer noticed it. His chest still ached from what he'd learned, but beneath the ache was resolve, steady and unshakable. It was the same calm he used to feel before a mission, a clarity that didn't come often anymore. Ghost limped toward him from the living room, tail giving a slow, brave wag. Caleb knelt and brushed a hand over the dog's side, careful of the healing leg. "Not tonight, buddy," he said softly. "We take it easy today." Ghost didn't agree. He nudged Caleb's jacket, then the door, then stared at him with that stubborn spark only a German shepherd could pull off. "You don't give up, do you?" Caleb whispered. Ghost barked once, quiet but firm. Fine, they'd work, but they'd work together. The day passed in long, silent hours. Caleb cleaned the metal box again, organizing Lucas's maps, the photos, the coded notes. He packed the documents into a waterproof duffel and hid it under the floorboards beneath his bed. Only he and Ghost knew the compartment existed. Every few minutes, the dog would limp to the front window and stare out across the tree line, ears twitching, listening. "Do you hear something?" Caleb asked. Ghost didn't bark. He didn't growl. He only stared, posture tall and alert. Caleb checked the woods twice, pacing the porch with his rifle slung across his shoulder, but never raised. He wasn't looking for trouble. He just couldn't shake the feeling the mountains were holding their breath. Night came early. A low fog drifted in, rolling between the pines like slow-moving smoke. Caleb double-checked the locks, pulled the heavy curtains, and set his lantern low. Ghost lay beside him on the rug, head on his paws, watching the door instead of sleeping. "You remember what happened last time?" Caleb murmured. "Me too." Ghost didn't blink. Hours passed. Caleb almost drifted off in his chair when Ghost's head snapped up. A soft sound came from outside, a crunch in the snow. Not heavy enough to be an animal, not careless enough to be an accident. Someone was there. Caleb slowly rose from his chair. Careful not to make noise, Ghost stayed at his side, muscles tense, leg trembling, but ready. The porch boards creaked. Caleb's pulse chilled. Then came another sound, a click, metal on metal. Someone was trying the garage door. Caleb grabbed the lantern, turned it low, and moved toward the hallway. He didn't touch the lights. He didn't speak. Ghost walked ahead of him like a soldier advancing down a corridor, quiet, controlled, and fearless. Another click. The lock gave. Caleb cursed under his breath. The intruder slipped into the garage. Caleb could hear the faint shuffle of boots on concrete. A shadow moved across the crack beneath the door. Whoever it was knew where to step, how to keep weight low, how to move without alerting the average homeowner. But Caleb wasn't average. He felt his PTSD rising, the way the edges of the world tightened and the air seemed thick. His breath shortened, his fingers tingled. Ghost nudged his leg gently. "Breathe." Caleb steadied himself and listened. A hinge squeaked. The driver's door of the semi. The intruder climbed inside. Caleb didn't hesitate anymore. He pushed the garage door open. "Hey!" The figure jerked in surprise, but before he could turn, Ghost lunged. It wasn't a violent impact. Ghost didn't maul or attack. He hit the intruder with enough force to knock him off balance and pin him to the metal floor. Teeth bared inches from the man's arm. Not closing, just warning. The intruder froze, breath sharp. Caleb strode forward, lantern in one hand, free hand balled into a fist. His voice was steady but cold, stripped of fear. "Move 1 inch," Caleb said, "and that dog will make you regret it." The man didn't move. His breath puffed in nervous clouds. Ghost's injured leg trembled, but he held firm because Caleb needed him. Caleb stepped closer, raising the lantern. The stranger was younger than he expected, maybe early 30s, scruffy beard, dark jacket, gloves. He wasn't carrying a visible weapon. But his eyes told a different story. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't curious. He was searching for something specific. "You broke into my property," Caleb said. "You want to tell me why?" The man swallowed. I just needed a look. I wasn't going to take anything." "Wrong answer," Caleb muttered. Ghost growled softly, not in rage, but in steady threat. The man hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the hidden compartment, toward where the steel panel sat sealed again. Caleb's stomach turned. "You knew what you were looking for," Caleb said. "How?" The man closed his eyes briefly, as if weighing a decision. "I was told someone found the Reed truck." The world around Caleb blurred for a second. Ghost sensed the shift and pressed harder on the man's shoulder. "You say that name like you know something," Caleb said quietly. The man hesitated, then nodded. "I knew Lucas, not well, but enough." Every breath Caleb took felt like broken glass. "What do you want?" "I just wanted to see if the stories were true," the man whispered. "About what he built, about why he disappeared." Caleb shook his head slowly. "You're going to stand up, slowly, and you are going to walk out of here without a single lie. If you try to run, if you try anything stupid, he'll catch you." The man nodded vigorously. Caleb snapped his fingers twice. Ghost stepped back but stayed close, watching. The man rose, hands raised. "Out," Caleb said. They stepped into the snowy night. The cold hit hard, clearing the fog in Caleb's mind. Ghost limped beside him, but didn't waver. "Who told you to come?" Caleb asked. The man hesitated. "Someone who doesn't want the truth out. That narrows it down to half the county." "I swear I wasn't going to hurt anything," the man said. "I just needed to know if the compartment was real." Caleb stiffened. "And is it?" he asked. The man swallowed hard. "Yes." Ghost growled low, but Caleb gently tapped his shoulder. "Why does it matter to you?" Caleb asked. The man stared at the ground. "Because I owe Lucas my life." The wind paused. The woods seemed to listen. Caleb's throat tightened. "You're going to explain," he said. The man nodded. "I will, but not tonight. You're not safe." Caleb frowned. "Safe from who?" The man stepped back toward the dark tree line. "From the same people who made your brother disappear." Ghost barked sharply. "And now that you've opened that truck," the man said, voice shaking, "they know." Then he turned and vanished into the fog. Caleb didn't chase him. He stood there, breath turning to frost, Ghost leaning against his leg for warmth and support. The quiet of the mountains wrapped around them. But the peace was gone. The storm had found them, and it wasn't stopping now. By dawn, Caleb felt the weight of the night still clinging to his skin. He barely slept. Ghost, too, had stayed restless, waking at every distant crunch of snow or shift in the wind. The mountains felt different now, like an audience holding its breath. When Caleb finally stepped outside, the cold hit harder than usual. The sun hadn't yet broken through the heavy Montana clouds. A thin frost coated the trees, turning the pines into silent, gray sentries. Ghost limped beside him, stubborn as ever. "Easy," Caleb whispered. "You did enough last night." But Ghost refused to stay inside. He stood at the semi-steps, watching Caleb with eyes that said he wasn't going anywhere. Caleb sighed. "All right. Together." Inside the garage, the semi loomed like a relic of war. It felt alive now. Not just a machine, but a vault of truths someone had tried to bury. And the files inside, they were too big, too dangerous, too important for one man to carry alone. Lucas had died for them. Caleb wasn't going to let that happen again. He grabbed the duffel bag with the documents, slung it over his shoulder, and headed for his truck. Ghost climbed into the passenger seat, his seat, settling with a determined grunt. They drove toward town. The snow made the road crunch under the tires, the mountains fading into pale shapes beyond the tree line. Every mile brought back old memories, therapy visits, grocery trips where the clerk avoided eye contact, whispered judgments behind his back. But today, none of that mattered. He had a mission. 40 minutes later, he pulled into the small parking lot behind the local attorney's office. A weathered wooden sign read E. Stone, Legal Services, Family, Estate, Civil Matters. Nothing fancy, nothing corporate. That was why Caleb chose her. Eleanor Stone was in her late 50s, a widow who had lost her son in Afghanistan. She understood veterans in a way no one else in town did. She never rushed Caleb, never treated him like a broken man. Ghost followed him inside, tail swishing politely. Eleanor looked up from her desk. "Morning, Caleb." "Ghost." Her gaze softened. "Rough night." "You could say that." Caleb set the duffel on her desk. "I need you to see something, and I need you to believe me." She leaned forward. "If it's coming from you, I already do." Caleb opened the bag when he spread the documents across her desk. Maps, lists, photos, coded notes. Eleanor's breath caught. She wasn't easily rattled, but her eyes widened at the stamps, the handwriting, the dates. "My God," she whispered. "This is federal, deep federal." Caleb nodded. Lucas built something inside that truck, something they didn't want anyone to know about. Eleanor picked up one file carefully, as though afraid it might crumble. Operation Night Passage. Ghost Line. "Caleb, these are off-book operations. If this is real, it's real," he said, voice steady. "Everything in that truck is real." Ghost nuzzled Caleb's hand, grounding him. Eleanor's face turned serious. "You understand what having these means, right? It's not just dangerous, it's historic. If the right journalist saw this, it could expose a buried program." "I know," Caleb said. "I want the truth out, but not recklessly." Eleanor took a slow breath. "I know someone who might help. Someone honest. Someone who isn't afraid of stories like this." She picked up her phone. After 3 rings, a voice answered. Caleb couldn't hear the words, but he could see Eleanor's expression shift from cautious to focused. "Yes," she said. "He's here. Yes, you need to see it yourself. Today." She hung up and turned to Caleb. "She'll be here in an hour." "Who?" Caleb asked. "Sarah Cole." Caleb blinked. "The investigative reporter?" Eleanor nodded. "The one who broke the Jackson County corruption case. She's relentless and trustworthy." "Absolutely." Caleb leaned back in the chair,
His chest tightened, not with fear, but with anticipation.
If Sarah saw what Lucas had left behind, the truth would finally have a voice. An hour later, Sarah Cole arrived, mid-40s, sharp eyes, a notebook always in hand. Ghost sniffed her once, decided she passed inspection, and sat beside Caleb. "I hear you've got something big," Sarah said. Caleb spread the documents on the table again. Sarah's eyes widened, then narrowed, then sharpened with that journalist's instinct for lies and, more importantly, for truths. She read everything, quiet, focused, turning pages gently, scanning each note, each photo. After 15 minutes, she looked up. "Caleb, this isn't just a hidden operation. This is a ghost program, an unacknowledged humanitarian route." "My brother ran it," Caleb said.
"And he was erased," Sarah whispered. "Not listed, not honored, not even recorded as lost in action. That doesn't happen by accident." Caleb's hands tightened. Ghost pressed against his leg. Eleanor folded her arms. "Sarah, level with us. How dangerous is this?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "This kind of program, if someone buried it, they had a reason, and they won't want it resurfacing. But exposing it could change public records, reopen cases, honor the people who risked their lives." Caleb leaned forward. "Then let's do it." Sarah met his eyes. "I'll help you. But we need more than documents. We need proof the truck was used for this. Photos, old route logs, survivor testimony, anything." Caleb swallowed. "There is more in the truck." Sarah blinked. "Then we start there." Ghost barked once, sharp, decisive. As they gathered the files, Caleb felt something shift inside him. For years, he'd felt like he was fighting shadows. PTSD, guilt, whispers in town, silence about Lucas. But now, for the first time, the world wasn't ignoring him. People were listening. People were helping. He wasn't alone in this mission anymore. And that frightened him almost as much as it comforted him. On their way out, Sarah paused beside him. "Caleb, once this starts, it can't be undone. The truth will either set things right or bring more danger." Caleb glanced at Ghost, who stood tall despite the healing leg. "They came after us already," he said. "I'm done running." Sarah nodded slowly. "Then let's bring your brother home." As Caleb stepped out into the brightening Montana afternoon, snowflakes beginning to fall again, he felt the world tilt. Lucas's story was rising from the dark. And now it was Caleb's turn to carry the torch. The wind swept across the valley as Caleb pulled into his driveway, the tall pines whispering like they knew what was coming. The sky was a pale winter blue, the kind that made the world feel too still, too quiet. Ghost eased down from the truck's passenger seat, moving with a stiffness that still worried Caleb, though the dog hid it well. "Easy," Caleb murmured, steadying him. "Almost there." He glanced at the semi parked in the garage. The old machine looked different now. Not newer. Never that. But alive. Awake. Like it had been waiting all these years for someone to finally understand it. Inside, Sarah and Eleanor were already waiting. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil and the cold, metallic scent of winter. Sarah had her camera equipment out, setting up shots around the cab. Eleanor sorted the documents into labeled folders, making sure nothing was overlooked. "This is going to make history," Sarah said quietly. "Not headlines. History." Caleb didn't care about history. He cared about the truth. and he cared about finishing what Lucas started. Ghost hopped into the Semi's cabin, limping but determined. He sniffed the steel walls as if making sure the space still remembered him. Caleb climbed up after him and removed the final steel panel slowly, gently, like opening a sacred book. The compartment lay open again, documents neatly arranged. Sarah lifted her camera and started recording. "This isn't just evidence," she murmured. "This is a testimony." Caleb reached inside and retrieved Lucas's final notebook. Its pages smelled faintly of diesel and dust, the ink faded but stubborn. The last entry still ended mid-sentence. "If they come after you." Caleb traced the torn edge with his thumb. "He was trying to warn someone," Caleb said quietly. "Maybe even me." Ghost leaned into him as if urging him to keep going. They filmed for hours. Maps, photos, coded notes. And the reinforced structure Lucas had built. Sarah documented every weld, every hidden vent, every detail that proved the truck wasn't just transportation. It had been a lifeline. When they finally stepped outside, the sun was beginning to set. Warm gold spilled across the valley, catching the snow in soft sparks. Eleanor rubbed her hands together for warmth. "So," she said, "what's next?" Caleb looked at the Semi. The machine loomed tall and steady, its shadow stretching across the frozen ground like a long road pointing towards something bigger. "I rebuild it," Caleb said. "Not just the parts, the purpose." Sarah stared at him. "You mean drive the roots?" "Not the same ones," Caleb said. "But there are still people who need help, people who slip through the cracks, people nobody listens to or protects." "Lucas believed in helping them. And you do too," Eleanor murmured. Ghost barked once, low, certain. Caleb touched the truck's steel, feeling its cold weight under his palm. "This wasn't a hiding place," he whispered. "It was sanctuary. Lucas didn't build a secret. He built a promise." Sarah's eyes softened. "Then let the world hear it." The next weeks passed in relentless work. Late nights, early mornings, cold Montana winds biting at exposed metal. Caleb rebuilt the Semi from the inside out. He followed Lucas's sketches exactly. Reinforced walls, discreet ventilation, storage compartments disguised as structural beams. He added subtle upgrades of his own, careful not to betray the original integrity. Ghost remained beside him every moment, sometimes sleeping on a blanket in the corner, sometimes watching with alert eyes, sometimes nudging Caleb lightly when he worked too long without resting. "You're the boss," Caleb would mutter with a tired smile. When the truck's exterior repaint was finished matte steel gray, understated and sturdy, the old Semi looked reborn, not as something shiny or new, but as something trustworthy, a guardian on wheels. Finally the day came. The last bolt tightened, the last test passed, the last switch flipped. Caleb stood before the Semi in the cold morning air, Ghost at his side. The mountains glowed pink with sunrise. The world felt still, expectant. He climbed into the driver's seat. Ghost hopped up beside him, tail wagging softly. Caleb turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, deep, steady, powerful. Like a heartbeat returned. Ghost's ears perked. Caleb's eyes stung. "This is for you, Lucas," he whispered. They pulled out of the driveway slowly, the snow crunching under the heavy tires. As they drove through town, people stopped in their tracks. The same folks who once laughed now froze with wide eyes, watching silently as the resurrected giant passed by. No one jeered, no one smirked, no one dared. Respect doesn't always sound loud. Sometimes it's pure, stunned silence.
Caleb didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. At the highway entrance, he slowed. The morning sun streaked across the windshield. The mountains opened wide before him, stretching into miles of possibility. He reached out and placed his hand gently on the cabin wall. "Lucas," he said quietly, "I'll finish the road you started." Ghost lifted his paw and rested it on Caleb's hand. Together, they faced forward. Caleb eased the semi onto the open highway. The engine's hum steadied. Ghost leaned in close. The mountains welcomed them home. This wasn't just a truck anymore. It wasn't just a legacy. It was purpose, direction, healing. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt whole. As the semi rolled toward the horizon, sunlight glinting across its steel frame, it carried with it something the world needed. A story once buried, a truth reborn, a mission unfinished, now alive again, and the road ahead, long and winding, was ready for them both.